Tara Brown and the Swinging London Colour Revolution by Vic Jenham. Chapter 9, Part 1. In March, Julian was born by way of a caesarean, and I became a father for the second time, and 20 for the first time. Again, I felt the need to provide for my family. This time, I took the needs of my flatmates into account. Finding family support for the brightness of the idea, I bought myself into a garage in nearby Bayswater, which was making a name for itself as a Lotus dealer and special services centre. Len Street, the bloke's name was. He'd worked for Jim Clark, the Formula One champion, so I believed his every word. Len had been a foreman at Lotus in Hertfordshire, where they made the Elite and the Elan, the one I was driving. I was a regular at his store, and one day I simply asked him if he would let me take a financial interest in his business, which he would. Len taught me how to truly fix a car, and I was, as always, a fast learner. I loved fast cars. I thought they were the pinnacle of human achievement at the time, their beauty and speed and their surprising comfort unsurpassed by any other exciting invention. I spent a lot of time at the garage and helped them move to a more upscale address at Drayton Gardens off the Fulham Road. Nothing wrong with Bayswater, which was just across Hyde Park, but the money was on the other side in those months. Soon after our move, I started receiving inquiries from the East London crime scene, first at the clubs we both used to frequent, and after some rumours going round on the doorstep, whether we were able to fix up their cars so they could do maximum speed for whatever short distance. They needed getaway cars to escape from the police. Being a successful police escapee myself, I understood those needs. I also knew what to do to make their wish come true, and I kind of liked the idea. I wanted to be a bit of a bad boy. I didn't want my sons to later ask me, "Dad, why were you such a boring father?" I had better start working on my legacy, now with 2 sons biting at my ankles. So I became a specialist at extorting full energy from any type of engine. I bored cylinders, maximized air intake, juiced up petrols. I knew where to get that little extra from. Even tires wouldn't escape my attention. I once offered slicks to a well-known bad guy who went about the same joints as me, claiming it will give you up to 20% more speed and they last at least 30 miles. I'm not sure anymore if he took the bait, but others certainly did. The problems with slicks being they may last 10 laps on a smooth racetrack surface, but likely much less on England's public roads. Len had mixed feelings about my niche endeavour. He didn't like what our clientele were doing, but he agreed the money was good. In June, we all woke to the news that the Beatles were awarded an MBE, a membership of the British Empire, perhaps the highest honours ordinary people can get. It immediately created backlash in the form of previous recipients sending their title back in protest. I asked Nicky, "What do you think? Is this the Queen trolling Sir John's society? Or is it the society trolling the Queen?" "Do you think the Queen makes these decisions on her own?" my beautiful wife asked. "Probably not." Well, there you have your answer. "It feels unnecessarily cruel," I concluded. "Why MBE? Couldn't she just give them a medal for export achievements or something?" Summer was full of news for my pals. Paul had their film out, Help, and then went on to America to play the Shea Stadium in New York, while Brian had to swallow how Mick and Keith were scoring a mega hit with Satisfaction, a fantastic song by all means. And everybody knew it, everybody said, "That's a damn good song. That one is going to last 50 years," someone said, which we all found a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, who was thinking in half a century from now? Mick commented, "Keith came with that riff, and I knew right away how to fill up the gaps between the chords. I had this idea of criticizing consumer behavior, and then the words rolled out by themselves." True or not, it was commentary worth of its time. In July, the Scotch of St. James opened at Mason's Yard in St. James, halfway Soho and Kensington. Within days, it was decided that the Scotch was going to be our new hangout. I can't say it was always a better venue than the elegant Adlib for hanging out, but it had a great stage that all the going bands of the day wanted to have been on. And they would, over the course of the next year and a half. Besides, a lot of money was already invested in the Scotch, so it had better become a success. What the owners of the new joint could always count on was the in-crowd's inherent need for change. A new girl, a new flat, a new record, a new hangout. I wasn't much into changing girlfriends, being a married man and father of 2 sons. I had no reason whatsoever to trade places, considering my financial possibilities and our home's location right around the corner of basically everything. And thirdly, I wasn't doing anything stunning, like many of our crowd were. I was Tara, of former midnight duo Nikki and Tara, now a mostly independent social influencer. I had, of course, a plus. I was good friends with both Paul and Brian, 2 of the scene's most prominent members. Paul always wanted to talk music and films, what he'd heard or seen, and I was more than fine with that because I needed to know what was going on. Brian was as much a child as me. He shared my interest in boys' games, so one day I bought us a king-size Scalextric set, which we laid out on the floor. We were smoking and drinking and having stupid fun, and Brian needed that. He would come by a lot whenever he was in town. So yes, I had my position, but I wasn't becoming more famous by the week, as they were, and certainly not for similar reasons. They were performing 5 times a week and filled up their free time with photo shoots and TV appearances. I believe Brian had always found it straining and would have liked a slower rhythm. At my place, he got the chance to chill out. There was this double feeling to our friendship. I was betraying them, as they were me. We were not being fully honest, because we all got a role to play in swinging London, and we each were sworn to keeping silent over whatever it was about us that wasn't real. I knew that the Beatles were helped a lot more behind the scenes than their fans were aware of, and so were the Stones. But our friendships were real. We liked each other. I was offering them a nice hangout, and they had accepted. We'd become the Den, a place where nobody would ask you for your autograph, and where everything was allowed. The fact that the biggest bands of swinging London were controlled opposition, so to speak, was of course well known by its members and their closest confidants, but never talked about. Many of them were talented musicians who had worked very hard to get an act together, and to admit the final step to stardom had only been possible because they had agreed to play a part in the great social engineering project called Generation Gap was painful. It was much nicer to pretend that the story spun by the media, that they were the natural embodiment of times to come rather than puppets on a string, was true. They were living in the lie upheld by everyone: record producers, photographers, the press, they themselves and their entourage, and of course the greater public, whether they were aware of it or not, that the profound changes society was going through were the product of purely spontaneous and accidental occurrences. A magnificent and exciting process that nobody in their right mind could even begin to predict the outcome of. And of course, many of them were trying to insert some of their own ideas into the narrative, making history a wonderfully democratic experience that invited every human to have a go. Or so the official explanation went. Nobody was allowed to challenge this view, if only so as not to jeopardize consumption profits. They were wonderful. We all were wonderful. In all those years that I bivouacked at the center of things, I never heard anything more than a vague allusion to the undercurrent that was guiding everybody's lives. The Beatles and the Stones may have discussed matters privately when there was nobody else around, but I very much doubt it. And anyway, there hadn't been many occasions where I was not present. All in all, the great secret created a very British atmosphere of hypocrisy. We were all so sharp and on the edge, but nobody would mention the elephant. Interestingly enough, these musicians' girlfriends were usually free of the burden. They were often well educated, good looking, and intelligent women who wanted them for everything they stood for, including being a fame craving fool who had sold his soul to the devil. At the same time, they themselves had done nothing more than engaging with someone like that, so there was no reason for them to carry blame. Some of them clearly felt they had something to offer in the sense of sanity and an analytical brain, and they were in their majority a positive force who helped their boyfriends keep their feet on the ground. I myself had Nicky, who just as me was a nobody. Our trick was always being at the center of things, which is more than just showing up where it happens. There was no avoiding us. We were the storytellers and the matchmakers of Midnight London. We were our own work of art. I often mentioned this to Nikki, and she agreed. The wags of our era were positively influential in many ways. They helped shape the image and personality of their star partners, sometimes by becoming icons themselves. I really loved Marian Faithfull. She was totally cool and smart. Of course, she took a bit too much of everything, but we all did. We were young and strong. It wasn't much of an issue in my days. Quite a few American acts on tour would pass by the Scotch. We all were there when Stevie Wonder played, promoting his music after his smash hit Uptight had catapulted him into everybody's attention. At only 15, Blind Stevie was an amazingly professional performer. Afterwards, I quickly was on his arm to introduce him to Paul McCartney, only to politely retreat immediately afterwards. In a way, I should be happy and proud things had gone the way they had. We were living happy days and the idea was spreading. London was largely on the up and other regions were following, or so it was said. You never knew for sure as a member of the in crowd. Still, that gnawing feeling wouldn't leave me. My pals were making it big, and I was just an old honorable. Nevertheless, life was smoothing on nicely in 1965. My mother was after our children, saying we weren't parenting and that the boys needed a welcoming home. Nicky wasn't totally against the idea, I had a feeling, but she couldn't bring herself to admitting it. So we stayed home in London, requiring the service of many nannies, since none of them stayed with us very long. I'd gone to placing classifieds once the acquaintance well had dried up, and a variety of girls who had been attracted by our dress showed up, expecting something chicer perhaps. There was this lovely Dutch girl who clearly was at the wrong door. "This is not what I'm looking for," she firmly stated after a quick look around the mess our place was typically in. We poured her some tea anyway. Her name was Ria. She was in London to work with little children. "That's what I'm good at," she said. She'd grown up on a farm and she knew Amsterdam because her big sis had moved there, but this was her first time out of the country. Ria was very good looking. She had the fresh, open face many Dutch girls have, and which you also see on the east coast of England, the English rose, if you will. Yet Ria combined it with deep brown eyes and a jawline which betrayed southern blood, Spanish perhaps. Her hair, thick and strong, was blonde. I gave her my card, just in case. Call me if you're looking for some fun. I know everybody. I don't know, Ria said. I can't promise. She said goodbye, and that was it. She never called, but I remember her looks. She carries herself well, I said to Nicky afterwards. Of course she does, answered my wife. She'll find a good place for herself. We found a girl soon ourselves after that and resumed our rhythms. We still hung out together because we liked each other, but our interests were diverging. I was into my cars, of course, and also maintaining relations with the hipsters. I was growing tired of hard partying and moved around the party houses mainly because they were my living rooms. Nicky was full on into nightlife and didn't show any signs of relenting, so we often coincided in the same places without being very much engaged in each other's story. There were, of course, always people who knew less than us, who had no friends among the in crowd and just liked being at the right place, in case something happened, and they might get themselves inadvertently on national TV. They would ask us about the latest on their favorite bands and performers, as if we were gossip traders. I would give them some stuff if nothing else was happening, and with all the hard-working artists and other creators hard at work, some nights inevitably had less star appeal to them than what the out crowd were used to. When the Beatles met Bob Dylan, who was in town to perform at the Royal Albert Hall, everybody were waiting for them to appear together in the club of their choosing. It didn't happen to me, and I wouldn't receive any convincing accounts of a snap visit in the days after. And then, out of the blue, Mummy Darling had found a pied-à-terre, not just in London, but in Belgravia, and not just in the neighborhood, but in our mews, almost across the street from ours, to be close to my grandchildren, as she motivated her move. But to us, it felt much more that she was again trying to get the boys out of our hands. In practice, it meant that the boys were spending a lot of time with Una, who had brought her own maid, making ours superfluous. We kept our nanny on until the boys had been back a few days, and then we said, we need to continue with an afternoons only regiment, and we're not sure that would suit you. She said, I may have to leave then. We're sorry. On the 23rd of July, the Beatles released the title song of their new album as single. Help was a cool song about why it's okay to be vulnerable, wrapped in speed and shout music. It definitely was different from previous releases, in that it presented the Beatles as a mildly rebellious group, self-conscious and concerned, yet always on the positive side of the debate. There were more songs on the album that explored this theme, though not always with the same energy. On the 6th of August, I was at the right place, being Brian Jones's flat in Elm Park Mews that night. The Birds were in town for a gig at Blazes, and afterwards everybody convened to Brian's. John Lennon and George Harrison were there too. I honestly hated the Birds. I thought their music was shameless. It had no power or influence, so why were they so big? I understood the British system, where sufficiently talented young musicians were offered support to create great hit songs. But these Americans didn't even know how to hold their instrument. America, which had given us such fantastic music, which had shown us the way in the 20th century, how could it cope with such blatant fakery? Yet these birds were sold as the latest reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and nobody thought a thing of it. I kept my opinion private, of course, and mingled with our American friends like everybody else. I soon noticed the birds were different off stage as well. They spoke of peace and love all the time and smoked gigantian amounts of grass, as they called it. Their behavior made meaningful conversation virtually impossible. While it's true we all love talking nonsense, meeting Americans still felt like an encounter with aliens, so you wanted to know everything about them. Yet these birds were totally out of it. All they did was repeat their frankly boring lines. At some point, I couldn't stand that twaddle any longer and proposed loudly, "Aren't love and peace a given? Civilization is unthinkable without them. I mean, you might as well take the next step." George Harrison liked my remark, but those birds were all over me. "You don't know American society, do you? Hate and war, that's more like it. You gotta be against the war, man. It starts with an attitude, but you've gotta love it too. Yeah, brother, love your attitude." I didn't want to upset my dear friend Brian's esteemed guests. My exquisite manners wouldn't allow for such behavior anyway. I did feel these people were very simple and inarticulate, as if saying peace and love all the time were going to change the world, something they were openly aiming for. Late September, Brian introduced me to his new girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg, who he had met in Munich when the band were touring Germany for 6 concerts. Anita had been around as a model and boasted an appearance in La Dolce Vita by Federico Fellini. Yes, we had seen that film and cameos in Andy Warhol films. Do you know Warhol? Yes, we have a print of his Coke bottle on the kitchen wall. Munich had been quite the spectacle, Brian told. We were in this huge hall and nobody of the public were allowed to stand up. There were police with dogs to keep the kids in their seats. At a Rolling Stones concert, can you imagine? So Mick starts teasing the pigs and the crowd by doing some goose steps. You know, how soldiers march at military parades, kicking their legs high up in the air. The place was going nuts. German youth are mostly anti-everything the older generation stand for, Anita explained. Especially the war and Nazism, of course. They understood very well what Mick was doing and were dying to join in. How do you say it? To take the piss out of the guards. But the dogs kept them down, all very tense and scary. "These kids want to destroy," said Brian. "We saw it elsewhere as well. In Hamburg, Essen, Berlin. Lots of negative energy they need to get rid of in Germany. And not just there. We were in The Hague last year in Holland. Great venue, a beautiful old casino hotel on the beach. From the first chords on, the kids were dancing in their seats, jumping in the aisles, and then trying to climb the stage where they were pushed back by police. I believe we didn't even finish our second song before we were commanded out the back door and raced back into town. Those Dutchies broke the house down that evening. Of course, the press blamed us for playing inflammatory music, but we were just the excuse. They had been waiting for the occasion." "It must be everywhere," I said. "I wouldn't call it a continental thing." "Ha, for sure," laughed Brian. "You don't want to know what Bradford can be like on a Saturday night." We had a nice evening out together. Nikki was there too, and she immediately got on with Anita. We would be seeing more of each other in the weeks to come.